diseases that manifest after you're done having kids are sometimes thought to be invisible to natural selection. And that's because it doesn't affect how many kids you have.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more.
Dr. Molly Fox is a biological anthropologist interested in the evolutionary context of chronic disease and the biosocial relationships between grandmothers, mothers, and children. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA. She's a founder and PI of the UCLA Biological Anthropology of Motherhood Lab. Her chapter in the CUP volume is titled Alzheimer's as a Disease of Evolutionary Mismatch, with a focus on reproductive life history. So thank you, Dr. Fox, for joining us. This is a really fascinating topic that touches so many people. So it's great to have you.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for your interest.
So a first point that you make in the chapter is about this kind of very crucial evolutionary point of visibility to selection. So could you briefly explain what this means, visibility of selection, to an uninitiated audience, and why this is particularly important to think about in explaining Alzheimer's?
So when we think about evolution, which is the non-random elimination of individuals from a community. So whether having a particular disease, in this case, means that you are either less likely to survive or less likely to really leave behind descendants who carry your genes. And the reason that this is tricky when you talk about diseases of aging is because diseases that manifest after you're done having kids are sometimes thought to be invisible to natural selection. And that's because it doesn't affect how many kids you have, because the disease or the trait didn't express itself when the number of kids you have was being determined. And so often when those of us in the evolutionary medicine community look to diseases that even have a genetic basis, but that don't express themselves till after you're done having kids, it's often thought, well, natural selection isn't really relevant for understanding this. And one of the reasons that I think that is an oversimplification is because humans as a species have a really unique strategy that is not the same for all animals. It's something that humans share with certain birds and a couple of other primate species, but not many, is that we're extremely interdependent, especially within families, but even within larger communities. And it would be impossible for a human mother to have the kind of reproductive pattern that she has without the help of her own mother, as well as other individuals in her family and community. And by that, I mean that humans are kind of special in that we're the only species that has overlapping dependent children of different ages. So if a mother had to be breastfeeding a little baby, but also feeding a toddler and also taking care of an older juvenile or young adolescent child all at the same time, it would be impossible, and feeding and taking care of herself and protecting all these kids, and they all have different needs. And so we have other members of the family who step in. And one of the most critical and consistently observed members of the family who helps mothers during this phase is the grandmother, or the mother's mom. And so the reason that I think this is relevant to Alzheimer's is because all of the ways in which grandmothers especially help daughters and daughters-in-law require their mind to be healthy, require them to have intact cognitive ability, whether it's minding children, feeding children, helping teach the pregnant woman how to manage her own body, or teach a young mother how to breastfeed. These are all things that require intact cognition. And so I think that Alzheimer's in two ways undermines these interdependent family structures. One, by not really permitting these benefits of living into old age. And then the second one is actually becoming a burden on members of your family. If you have a disease like Alzheimer's, you need to be taken care of by your family members. And so you're actually taking their time and attention and energy away from these tasks that otherwise you might be helping with. And so it could be a longer conversation, but that's that's one of the main reasons that I think. And then the other thing I just want to touch on briefly that I think is important here is the common misconception that humans didn't start living into old age until modern Western medicine. I think that that's also important to address. And the way that we think about the length of the lifespan of a species is a kind of difficult mathematical question. How do you say how long an animal lives? And it is true that the average age at death in humans has dramatically extended in recent history. But the largest sort of contributor to that effect is the diminishing rate of infant and early childhood mortality, which used to be 80 to 200 times higher, we think, than it is in Western societies today. And so, yes, the human lifespan has gotten a bit longer, but the average age at adult death amongst people who live today as hunter-gatherers is actually 72 years. So there have always been elderly people, but the average age at death itself has moved largely because of these enormously influential improvements in early life survivorship.
Right. So, yeah, Alzheimer's is kind of an unusual disorder, especially in this book, because so many mental disorders are early onset, and that makes like it's a real conundrum. Is like if you're affecting people at the age of 15 or 20, then you're really interrupting the reproductive success. And yeah, people might just think that old age diseases, selection hasn't happened, evolution can't see them. But yeah, you make this really good point that humans aren't like that when we're at least up to the age of 70. We should be around and we should be helping. So you also note that it seems like there might be some kind of mismatch happening here where individuals in modern societies are vulnerable to Alzheimer's in a way that perhaps our ancestors weren't, or people living in non-industrialized populations aren't. So could you talk a little bit about your possible reasons for thinking that this is important, and also mention some of these aspects of female reproductive health, which is central to your kind of work and the chapter as well?
Yeah, sure. So the mismatch idea is just the idea that there are aspects of modern life in the post-industrial developed world that are a dramatic departure from what would have been the norm for the majority of our species history. There is a huge shift in the lifestyles and environments in which we live. And what I have been interested in with Alzheimer's is the possibility that many of the things that the biomedical community has recognized as risk factors are just new in human history. The rates of things like obesity and diabetes are, strongly tied to processed foods and sedentism, lack of physical activity and exercise. And these are factors that are well recognized to be relatively recent. And so if those risk factors have emerged more recently, then maybe the disease is at a higher frequency than it would have been in the past. So those are the sort of more straightforward aspects. And if you think about the biology or the health of a woman, if in a past environment, she would have spent years and years of her life pregnant, and then even longer years and years of her life breastfeeding, if a child would have been breastfed for about 2.5 years, typically in the past. And these days, if women are having 1 or maybe 2 pregnancies and breastfeeding a child for 4 months, so, typically this means that the cumulative effect of those biological functions in your body are just going to be so different. The biological state in which you spend your life is just so dramatically different. And so I've been interested in how those changes might affect risk of Alzheimer's. And one of the reasons is because the biomedical community has now long recognized that some of the hormones involved in women's reproduction, especially estrogen, is protective against Alzheimer's.
So what are the possible clinical consequences you think that an evolutionary perspective kind of lends to research into Alzheimer's, perhaps in the terms of estrogen or mismatch? What do you think we can add to clinicians or to research that might kind of add something to the conversation to kind of prove why the evolutionary perspective is worth thinking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the first thing that comes to my mind about the clinical or public health implications here is that women's reproductive patterns are actually continuing to change. The change is not slowing down, it's actually speeding up. So for instance, the fertility rate across the world is just rapidly diminishing. And that is reaching more and more, this change is reaching more and more parts of the world as we move forward in time. And so if there is, say, a relationship between how many pregnancies you have and your later life risk of Alzheimer's, then we're looking at these huge public health shifts that we need to prepare ourselves for. We can't assume that the risk of Alzheimer's is just a function of how old you are or how long you live. If it's altered by something like how many pregnancies you have, well, the number of pregnancies in the previous generation on average is a lot higher than it's going to be in the next generation. And especially when you look at parts of the world that are only now becoming more industrialized and more developed, and having increasing access to contraception, which is happening in many parts of the world right now, we might be able to forecast what rates of certain geriatric diseases are going to be in the future. So that's one important area. I think that's a kind of large scale public health trend that we really need to understand. And then another one is just identifying at-risk individuals. So with a disease like Alzheimer's, it's very difficult to treat, and it's extremely difficult to make any difference clinically after a certain degree of disease progression has already occurred. But if you catch people early who are, for different reasons, considered at risk, there might be opportunities to slow the progression of this devastating disease. And there are, like I said, certain risk factors that we've already identified related to cardiovascular health and metabolic health, but maybe we can continue to identify important risk factors by understanding something as simple as reproductive history and how that may help us figure out who we should target these interventions towards. So those are two areas. And then a sort of more biomedical area where there's potential for intervention is trying to understand sex differences in Alzheimer's. It does seem to be the case that women have higher risk of Alzheimer's even at the same ages as men. There's been a controversy whether it's just that women live longer, but even men and women of the same ages, women do seem to have higher risk. And it's really fascinating. The more this is looked into, women seem to have a different biological signature of the disease than men. And so we do need to start looking at men and women differently in the way this disease develops and manifests to really try to help people.
Right. And that's something that's been missing from medicine so long, is recognizing the male and female differences, and so many drugs were only tested on males, and it's
definitely
it's good that we're kind of changing that. And I suppose an evolutionary approach can maybe justify that to some extent, especially in the context you're talking about of this huge difference, this huge change in fertility that we're seeing. Molly, Dr. Fox, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating topic that touches so many of us, and let's hope that we can do something to prevent and also to understand what's happening here. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. I hope everyone enjoys the book.